that, do you notice? Oh, by the way, this whole thing that I just read, that symbol wouldn't be there. The National Science Foundation, mind you, that would not be there unless this whole thing, this STEM equity thing, was funded by the National Science Foundation. I.e., if you're listening to this and you're in the US, this was funded by your taxpayer dollars. Okay, this wasn't my original plan for recording, but if y'all saw the live with Deb Hillman, the reason we learned yesterday, I thought this was appropriate to go on to. And I stumbled over it a little bit by accident, just I was just curious and started searching. And it started because I was sent the a link to a special issue of the Journal of Chemical Education, which was, of course, a diversity, equity, inclusion thing. And one of the articles, the one I have up here, is titled A QuantCrit Investigation of Society's Educational Debts Due to Racism and Sexism in Chemistry Student Learning. Now, the article is behind a paywall, so I'm not actually looking at the article, but I was curious, what the heck is QuantCrit? So I did some Googling, Google searching myself to get a little knowledge of that, and stumbled over this. The STEM equity site here, which handily gives us some definitions of what the heck QuantCrit is. And, of course, as you might guess, from what you can see here, QuantCrit is very much connected to critical race theory, or just to plain old critical theory, which loves to make assumptions about a lot of things. Here, and yeah, we will see that. Quantitative critical theory is what its proper name is. QuantCrit, as it were. So let us read, and I will provide you, because they handily lay out on this page, what the tenets of QuantCrit are. And it might look very familiar. So if you're seeing more stuff that comes from a QuantCrit perspective or quantitative critical perspective, this is what they're talking about. Critical race theory, CRT, began in the 1970s and 80s to address social injustice and racial oppression. Yes, we know this. It started in law schools, has since gone everywhere, and its basic key tenet is what? That racism is endemic to society. Never proves that. Never ever proves that. And that's going to be relevant again in a second. Never proves that, makes that assumption, and then builds all of its logically fallacious arguments off of that assumption. Subsequently, scholars in many fields, including education, have used CRT to guide their work in areas such as Latcrit, Femcrit, Asiancrit, and Whitecrit. Which, again, these are all critical theory-based things. So if you're seeing something crit now, you might be able to safely assume that it is something to do with critical theory. Each of these branches applies the defining characteristics of CRT, examining oppressive power structures. Let me stop right there. CRT assumes the structure of society, assumes it is all about power. And I will include for you in the description of this video the new discourses link describing critical race theory from translations from the Wokish, because it actually gets in there more so. Challenging the ideas of objectivity and considering intersectionality of individuals' identities, in novel contexts. The tenets of critical race theory are not explicitly qualitative, but CRT research has historically used qualitative methods. Most everything is qualitative with CRT, and most everything I have read that has used CRT has been logically fallacious. But anyway, the predominance of qualitative methods in CRT investigations is, in part, due to CRT's focus on individual narratives and counter-narratives. Lived experience trumps all, in other words. However, quantitative QuantCrit theory has emerged to inform the use of quantitative methods in ways consistent with the tenets of critical theory. You get why I jumped from the godforsaken article that Deb and I reviewed yesterday to actually come over here, because quantitative things based on logically fallacious arguments. This isn't going to end well. consistent with the tenets of critical theory. Scholars have proposed a set of tenets for QuantCrit research. We have attempted to synthesize these tenets and provide examples of how they can inform different stages of quantitative research in our tenets of QuantCrit workshop materials. So yes, this whole thing is available. And again, I will link it to you for you publicly. I encourage you to go have a look at it. It's a mess, is what it is. Allow me to show you. Tenets of QuantCrit. Quantitative critical QuantCrit research is a relatively new field of study grounded in critical theory. The nascency of QuantCrit has led multiple scholars to propose various related tenets. In what follows, we offer a synthesis of several tenets of QuantCrit we have applied to our research, their application to education research in general, and citations for more information. This first one is going to be, for those of you familiar with critical race theory, or critical theory more generally, this is going to be familiar. The centrality of oppression. QuantCrit researchers take as a fact that structural racism and sexism plague the U.S. economic, political, and educational systems. Gaps in student performance result from systems-wide policies and approaches that implicitly and explicitly disadvantage broad groups of students, particularly those that do not identify as white men. Students are oppressed for a myriad of dimensions of diversity beyond gender and race, including ableness, religious affiliation, and socioeconomic status. QuantCrit researchers commit to disrupting narratives that frame minoritized students as deficient and disrupting oppressive systems through anti-racist and anti-sexist work. Example research application. When discussing the causes of iniquities, QuantCrit researchers don't have to speculate about causes by a priori stating that the causes are racist, sexist, and classist power structures. Researchers can focus their discussion on identifying the mechanisms and impacts of these oppressive systems. Let me go back up here a little bit so you can see the rest of it. Again, does that sound familiar? Because anybody who's read a little bit on critical race theory would recognize that right away. It is the same assumption. It is the exact same assumption that every single little disparity, every single thing, every single gap, it is a logical fallacy. It is the disparity fallacy, as Coleman Hughes put it, in the more general kind of term. It is called single cause fallacy. Here, and they take it as their primary tenet that whenever there's a gap, its primary cause is the racist and sexist power structure. Never prove it. Critical theory has never proven any of this. Nobody has ever been able to actually demonstrate that the cause of a disparity is singularly that. But that is the assumption that is made by critical theory, by critical race theory, and now by this thing, QuantCrit. QuantCrit. And they're actually coming right out and saying it. We don't have to figure out what the cause is. We know what the cause is. We're enlightened. We know what the cause is here, right? This is not how science is done. This has no place in STEM. You do not assume the cause of something in STEM. You test it. You hypothesize what the cause is. Then you come up with the experiment to test it, and if you're wrong, well, you got to admit you're wrong, and that's not the reason why. This is starting from a conclusion and looking for evidence. They are starting from the conclusion and looking for evidence to support the conclusion. This is a bastardization of doing quantitative research. This is what QuantCrit amounts to. Just on this tenet alone, it is a bastardization of research. Data and methods are not neutral. Researchers often fail to adequately discuss the biases introduced in data collection and analysis method. What biases are you referring to? Because I can think of a bunch of different things that aren't related to racism, sexism, or what have you. Good example is that, okay, yeah, it's kind of hard to have weather measurement equipment everywhere. Sometimes you got places with gaps, and particularly in rural areas. Mostly because it's hard to get enough equipment out there to actually be able to measure things out there. That is not a systemic issue. That is not something of a systemic bias or the system failing. That is more so about the fact that it is really difficult to run a weather station into the middle of nowhere. This leads many researchers and readers to interpret quantitative findings as objective facts. Okay. QuantCrit research acknowledges that all data and analysis methods introduce biases and strives to minimize and explicitly discuss these biases. QuantCrit researchers avoid biasing findings by critically examining commonly used methods. For example, using p-values as go-no-go tests to identify differences between groups is particularly problematic in equity research. P-values depend on sample size. As many minoritized groups are underrepresented in sciences, collecting sufficiently large sample sizes to find statistically significant differences between students who are minoritized and white men is prohibitive for many research projects. The lack of data from minoritized students has led many research projects to find that racism's impacts are not statistically significant and conclude that equity was achieved. I've never seen them conclude that equity was achieved, to be honest. Saying I've never seen that when I've been reading all the papers that I've read related to this stuff. I've been reading enough of them now that's not one I've seen explicitly stated by anybody. That's not a conclusion I've seen explicitly stated by everybody. Finding that something isn't statistically significant. So, here's the thing. When you do statistical testing, you have a null hypothesis and you have an alternative hypothesis. When you hit the test that you are doing with your p-values, which represents effectively the significance of something, or the way I like to help folks understand it is the p-value is the likelihood of something happening by chance. What you then set statistically is a threshold limit for whether or not you're willing to accept or reject your null hypothesis based on what threshold you want the p-value to go under. You want to minimize the likelihood that something happened by chance. So the smaller the p-value is, technically, the more significant the result is. And what you often do with a hypothesis test is you either don't reject the null hypothesis or you reject the null hypothesis. Now, you notice something, it doesn't say accept alternative hypothesis, right? It says reject the null hypothesis or do not reject the null hypothesis. Or more precisely, the language is we fail to reject the null hypothesis. That's not saying that there's something that's not there that maybe you don't know about. It means that your test, your null hypothesis, isn't correct. If you get a low enough p-value, you would reject the null hypothesis. Your original hypothesis wasn't correct. That doesn't necessarily mean that your alternative hypothesis is correct. That's why you actually end up with multiple tests with p-values if you go on to do things, rather than just looking at a single thing. In most cases, if it's a simple enough test, then you might be able to say something with it. But no. There is never only one of these things if you're doing statistical analysis right. And in this, I will throw them a bone, because the thing with this is that, yes, there is a lot of misuse of p-values in different research paper. That has happened before. And it's not a surprise. At the same time, they do have their value, and when they're used right. But, you don't... it isn't just dependent upon sample size also. You also got to make sure you're talking about the specific test usually has its assumptions with it about the data itself. For example, some particular tests, like your standard t-test in statistics, relies on the data being normally distributed. What do I mean by normal distribution? Bell curve. Bell curve. Very, very rare to have it be a perfect bell curve. You can usually get away with it if it's close to being a bell curve or roughly a normal distribution. There's actually tests for that. And there's other tests that are not parametric that don't rely on assumptions about what the distribution is. But and p-values aren't there to represent uncertainty. I'm sorry. P-values don't just represent uncertainty, and confidence intervals are actually related to a p-value. Actually, most of the time, because most of the time what you're testing for with the p-value is something like the difference between the mean of two different samples. You might have a confidence interval that's associated with that difference, and it's also associated with the p-value. Often, if the p-value, not always, but often, if the p-value is indicating it's not a significant difference, for example, the p-value is like 0.1 or 0.15 or something like that, then that's usually not something that's significant. The confidence interval will share that. in the case of significant difference, if it's not a significant difference between the mean of two different samples, for example, you would have something that is a confidence interval that goes from a negative value to a positive value. It overlaps 0. So the other thing here is they're talking about, oh, yeah, lack of data from minoritized students has led many research projects to find that, yeah, I've never seen the conclusion about equity being achieved, for one thing, in there. This isn't, that's, I'd like to see where that actually exists in a study, where somebody's claimed that equity was achieved. But saying it's not statistically significant, again, they presume with the very first tenet that there's a single cause for everything. So to them, it has to be statistically significant. It has to be statistically significant for there to be, for that to work out. No, doesn't mean it's not. It doesn't mean it is at all. There's a heck of a lot of confounding factors with societal related stuff, including the representation in STEM, including the representation in a lot of different fields, including things that are going on in different parts of society. So no, I'm sorry. If it's not statistically significant, it may well be because there are other things aside from racism, which you assume is there all the time, that are having an influence. And perhaps having more of an influence. Again, this QuantCrit thing, like critical theory, like critical race theory, is assuming that racism and sexism are endemic to society. And, structures of power. Fact of the matter, I have over here the first tenet of critical race theory from the book, Critical Race Theory, an Introduction by Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanchik. Quote, what do critical race theorists believe? Probably not every member would subscribe to every tenet set out in this book, but many would agree on the following propositions. First, that racism is ordinary, not aberrational, normal science, the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. That is the assumption that critical race theory makes. That is the assumption that QuantCrit makes in this. Although they extend it to include sexism, apparently, from their tenets shown here. But yeah. No, I'm sorry. This tenet is built off the first tenet, which makes a faulty assumption straight from the gate. Data cannot speak for itself. Well, yeah, data doesn't speak for itself. That one's actually a given because of the fact that you have researchers involved who have to interpret a bit of the data. When researchers present data or findings without explicitly providing a perspective, readers will likely interpret data and findings through the dominant perspective, which often leads to racist and sexist interpretations. See Tenet 1. Such interpretations reinforce existing deficit narratives about minoritized groups. When discussing differences between demographic groups, QuantCrit researchers don't refer to them as the impacts of gender or race gaps, but the impacts of sexism and racism. One way to do this in educational settings is to frame the differences as educational debts that society owes the students. Goes back, you might notice a pattern here. It all goes back to that first tenet. It all goes back to that first faulty, logically fallacious mess of an assumption that nobody's been able to prove, analytically anyway. Hey, Purple. Nobody's been able to prove analytically anyway, in that, yeah, racism and sexism is everywhere. And so if you don't put in the thing that this is caused by racism and sexism, they're going to assume it's not. So you got to put it in there, right? Okay, and I would immediately ask the question, okay, readers will likely interpret the data and finding through the dominant perspective. How do you know that? Can you prove that? I like the evidence of that. I want a data, I want citation, I want to see it myself. Prove it. Which often leads to racist or sexist interpretations. Yeah, no, I don't buy it without the evidence there. Such interpretations reinforce existing deficit narratives about minoritized groups. Really? Can you prove it? Again, can you prove it? You give me nothing with this. You give me absolutely nothing. Groups are neither natural nor inherent. This is the fourth tenet, I think. Fourth or fifth tenet. Yeah, this is the fourth one. In U.S. society, we often take one's racial and gender identity as being immutable features of a person. QuantCrit research reframes these aspects of individuals' identities as being socially constructed and fluid. Statistical analysis requires aggregation of data to support claims about group outcomes. QuantCrit research strives to create models that respect students' identities. QuantCrit researchers minimize student data aggregation, representing as much diversity in student outcomes as their data can reasonably allow. When aggregating data, QuantCrit researchers should do so in transparent ways that do not erase students and respect their identities. Okay, I got a question for you. What if I identify as me? What if I reject your characterization of me? Because this is one of the things I despise about the way DEI is done, the way critical theory is done, and the way QuantCrit is done. You are the one presuming that I hold as important my race or my sex or what have you. To me, race and gender are immutable characteristics. I don't really care what another person's race or gender identity or sex or anything like that is. Not important. Not important. In the slightest, it is not important. Why are you the one who gets to say that all these things are socially constructed? If it is so the case that it is fluid to you, who the hell are you to say it's socially constructed to begin with? Who the hell are you to say that in the slightest when I can choose what I want my identity to be? When I am the one who decides my identity, and my identity, my sense of self, if you will, is a hell of a lot more than those social categories that you're using to derive everything with this in terms of power and what have you. Let's not forget, critical theory looks at this in terms of structures of power, right? With there being oppressed and oppressor categories along each different group of race, sex, gender, and all the way down. What if I don't particularly care to be categorized like that by you, who is attaching a stereotype to me? How are you going to work with that? How are you going to respect those identities that reject your categorization and your stereotyping of people? How are you going to work with that? And how are you going to work with that quantitatively, given that this is QuantCrit that we're talking about? Let's see. Yeah, it's some of the most despicable things that you all make the presumption with this woke nonsense that my identity, that someone's identity is defined by others necessarily. No, defined by my choices and my actions. Same for anyone else. And it's certainly not defined by race and gender. Certainly not for me. And there's a lot of people who believe that, but you all don't take that into account whenever you think about these kinds of things, different worldviews. Taking an intersectional perspective. Hey, look. Identity is multifaceted, each aspect of which exists along an axis. The interaction at the intersection of these axes shapes an individual's experience of the world. For example, black women experience racism differently from black men and sexism differently from white women. Example research application. When developing statistical models, QuantCrit researchers explore the additional information that including interaction terms for demographic variables provides. By having an interaction term for gender and race, a model can predict the impacts of sexism and racism in ways that are not merely additive. So let's again remind you here that when they're talking about this in terms of the modeling side of things, they're saying that they'll use interaction terms for the demographics in here. Yes. And I don't actually have a problem with that. From a statistical perspective, you can do it. But how they will frame it in every paper, because of their first tenet right there, that racism and sexism is endemic to everything, it is the cause of every single gap that there is, which is, again, a logical fallacy to the nth degree at this point. And this notion of intersectionality, of course, which is a flawed concept by itself. I'll get to that in a second. The other thing here is that they will always frame it in analysis and research write-ups. Wherever you see QuantCrit present, frame it in research write-ups as being any gap being the result of racism and sexism, and being able to quantify that intersectionality by including the interaction terms of race and race to gender, or race to sex, or whatever number of different little intersections that you would like in a statistical model. No amount of mathematics knowledge, no amount of statistics knowledge, no amount of scientific understanding gives anyone a moral compass. There's a reason that we have to be dedicated to the idea that, we don't start from a conclusion, which what this QuantCrit knows definitely does. It starts from the conclusion that racism and sexism is endemic and looks for it in every aspect of life. Like I said, they admitted it themselves right here. When discussing the cause of inequities, QuantCrit researchers don't have to speculate about the causes by a priori stating that the causes are racist, sexist, classist power structures. They don't care about the actual cause of anything. They don't care about the cause of the gaps. They start from the logically fallacious conclusion that every single gap is caused by this one thing. That's it. Oh, goodness. Where was I? Oh, yeah, intersectionality. The other thing I want to make a point about with intersectionality is that it is a load of garbage, really, in the sense, because in theory, with intersectionality, you could keep making classifications and oppressor categorizations within those classifications to the nth degree, including like hair color and glasses and height and weight, and keep on going down the lines and things you've experienced and not experienced, and have you lived here and have you lived over here and all this kind of other stuff. You could do that in theory to the point where you would only ever describe one person, but they can never do that because it has to be about groups. Jordan Peterson actually pointed this out at one point. Valuing the narrative and counter-narrative. And I promise we're almost done, but there's one last thing at the end you gotta see to understand why this is a huge heck of an issue. Valuing narrative and counter-narrative. Critical theory places great value on individuals' lived experiences. Narrative and counter-narratives capture these experiences. Counter-narratives represent the experiences and perspectives of minoritized people and often contradict our culture's dominant narratives. Our educational system is meritocratic. QuantCrit researchers strive to include people's voices from minoritized groups in data and research teams to ensure diversity in the narratives produced. QuantCrit researchers can incorporate counter-narrative in a variety of ways. Remember that counter-narrative is all about embedding theory. We talked about that in an article that I reviewed. For example, QuantCrit researchers can integrate testimonials into mixed methods analyses, which is a type of statistical analysis. QuantCrit researchers also strive to develop research teams with diverse experiences, perspectives, and identities. In projects where the research team lacks diversity, hiring an equity consultant to perform an audit of the work can provide a needed perspective. Final note, there are other tenets of critical theory that inform our work, but we do not include those here for the sake of brevity, e.g. interest convergence. Yes, that is another tenet of critical theory. In creating this list, we focused on the tenets that have been most influential in shaping our QuantCrit research. I could summarize it for you. You only needed one. The fact that you made that logically fallacious assumption, the same one that critical race theory does, that racism and sexism is endemic to society and causes every single disparity. That is a logical fallacy straight from the jump. So if you're going at it from a QuantCrit perspective, you are going at it immediately from a logical place of a logical fallacy and a very, very flawed premise. Now, here is the one last thing I want to point out to you. Let us scroll to the end of the page. Oh, you can't quite see it. Shoot. Here. You can't quite see it. I'm going to try and get this in here so you can momentarily. Hang on. Hang on. Do you see this? Do you see this lovely little symbol here? As I move this around a little bit so you can see. By the way, this whole thing, that symbol is there for a reason. You can't see the ending text there, but I will put it for you in the description so you can go see it. Hang on, we'll try and get this in here real quick. There it is. A little bit more. I'm almost there. I've almost got it, guys. What is that, do you notice? Oh, by the way, this whole thing that I just read, that symbol wouldn't be there. The National Science Foundation, mind you, that would not be there unless this whole thing, this STEM equity thing, was funded by the National Science Foundation. I.e., if you're listening to this and you're in the US, this was funded by your taxpayer dollars. And you can actually see it because they have the grant number like they're supposed to. They have to have the grant number if it's something that's paid for by the National Science Foundation. And if you don't believe me, let me see, 1928596. Right here. Here it is. I'm going to zoom in a little bit for you, but this is it right here. I will include this information for you. But this was paid for by your taxpayer dollars. Right here. Division of Human Resources Development to an awardee called Chico State Enterprises, which I do not know what that is. I'm presuming that it might be a private enterprise company, but 1928596 is the grant number, and there it is right there, right? It is right here for you. Now you want to see how much is being paid for, and it's actually not done yet. This doesn't wrap up until next year. Actually, September 30th, 2023 is the estimated end date. What would you like to know? $2 million. $2 million taxpayer dollars. I hope you enjoy it, because you're spending a whole lot of money on this. Taxpayers of the U.S. are paying a heck of a lot of money for something that is based on incredibly logically fallacious bullcrap. That's it. All you needed to know. QuantCrit, load of garbage. That's it for now. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way at the door if you like this video. Comment on the video. Share the video. Subscribe to the channel. All that lovely good jazz. And of course, come on over to Locals. The Thursday review is going to return this week. I don't know what I'm reviewing yet. I got to figure that out. But it is going to return this week, rather. So yeah, come on over and join us. Till next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious, my friends.